Hello there. Welcome to our third and final installment on adaptations to extreme conditions. Hey everyone, hope you're well. Welcome back. I'm just checking in, making sure that you're all up to date. So this is just taken from Canvas, and by the time we start lessons again on next Wednesday, this is what you should have completed. So all of the chapter questions up to this point, and as well as having watched this short video and completed a small submission based on that. Today we are doing our final lecture for chapter 5, which is adaptations to extreme environments. Today we'll be looking at plant adaptations in particular. So what are the three things that a plant in the Australian outback, a very arid, desiccated, low rainfall, soil poor environment needs to do? They need to increase their water intake, they need to reduce their water loss, their transpiration, and they also need to produce drought-resistant seeds so that they can pass on their genes to the next generation in times of drought or severe weather crisis. So when we're talking about maximizing water intake, the main way that plants take in water is through their roots, their root system. So we have a very common tree in Australia called the acacia, and the acacia is something known as a water tapper root system. And that means, as you can see here, it grows very, very long roots that tend towards the waterbed, and then when the roots hit the waterbed, they grow some roots out laterally, that is sideways, and this is one of the ways to maximize water intake. There's also lateral roots that grow at the surface as well, but we mostly see this deep growth of roots and then a lateral growth at the waterbed. All right, let's talk about minimizing transpiration, minimizing water loss. When we're talking about water loss, we are talking about the leaves. That is the main structure of the plant that we're referring to. Transpiration, that is water loss, mostly occurs through the stomata. The stomata, as we know, are they mean mouth. They're the openings that are on the underside of the leaf. That is also where the plant gets its intake of carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Two climate factors that affect transpiration are heat, obviously. So an increase in heat, increase in temperature, increases transpiration as water is evaporated out through the surface and mostly the stomata. Also, wind will increase transpiration. So as wind whips past the stomata, the underside of the leaf, it can also take with it little droplets of water. So plants need to have structures with their stomata and their leaves to reduce the impact of wind and temperature on transpiration, to reduce transpiration. Just a quick review of what stomata are. They are the plants, they're the mouth-like openings on the underside of a plant. That is through which transpiration of water occurs outwards and through which an uptake of carbon dioxide occurs for photosynthesis. So let's look a little bit closer at the stomata and their structural adaptations. A couple of things that stomata can do is there can just be a few less of them. Less stomata, there's going to be less opportunities for transpiration to occur. Another thing is that we can see the presence of shrunken stomata. So if we look at this diagram here, this is a stomata that is on the surface, so it's reasonably exposed to the elements, so the wind and heat. This one on the far right here is a stomata that is shrunken. So it is protected on either side by the guard cells, so it is not as highly exposed to wind and temperature as with this one here. So we see less stomata, we see shrunken stomata. We also sometimes see some little hairs around the outside of the stomata, and this reduces the impact of harsh winds against, so therefore reducing transpiration. Okay, let's look at a few structures of leaves. So we're familiar that most leaves have a thick, waxy cuticle to prevent water being lost just via evaporation. This cuticle is made from a lipid-like substance called cutin. That's one of the structural adaptations. Another leaf structural adaptation concerns the shape and the size. So if you look at this leaf on the left here, this is going to be a leaf from a tropical environment. See how it's flat, it's got a huge surface area to volume ratio, which means that there are more opportunities for water to transpire or evaporate out. Here we have a succulent, and here we have a Hoya. So these two have similar leaf structures. They're much narrower than the Monstera on the left. they are thicker, which will reduce their surface area to volume ratio. So we know when things are thicker, they have a lower surface area to volume ratio, and they're often smaller. And here, this is a healthy Hoya I have in my house, absolutely beautiful. I kept him out of direct sunlight. This one here, I left in the sun on a 40-degree day. So don't do that. This is not what we want. Okay, so that's leaf shape and size, and it's all to do with surface area to volume ratio. So tropical broad fat leaves, in arid environments we have cylindrical, smaller and narrow leaves. Another feature of leaves that reduces transpiration is their color, or their gloss, or their sheen. So leaves that are glossy and shiny are reflective, and if things are reflective, they're going to bounce back the radiant energy from the sun away from them, which means that they won't get as hot, which means that the heat won't increase transpiration. So if we have leaves that are shiny or silvery or glossy, they're going to reflect heat away from them, making them cooler, and meaning that evaporation and water loss via transpiration won't be as drastic. What's also important is the actual margins of the leaf. So around the edge of the leaf here, that's where the top and the bottom touch. That's the thinnest part of the leaf. Now, when that part of the leaf is thin, there is some cooling that can occur there. And if you increase the surface area around the thinnest part of the leaf, more cooling can occur. So this leaf here on the left is going to cool in a much more efficient rate because there is more of the thin leaf that is exposed. Okay. Another feature of leaves are their orientation. So if we consider the sun being sort of mostly above us at all times during the day, the sun's radiant energy hitting from above is going to be much more drastic on a horizontally oriented leaf. The vertical leaf that you see here is not going to be as drastically impacted by the radiant energy of the sun. Therefore, its transpiration will be reduced. This is typical in a lot of Australian plants like gum leaves, which have a vertical orientation so as to avoid the impact of the sun. Other leaf adaptations are things like not really having visible leaves. So cactus here, they're not leaves. These are actually the stems of the cactus that are filled with water-rich cells. So this why they're basically just the stems of the leaf that have just been filled with water. And these little spikes on the leaves here are what are like the vestigial leaves, what was left of the leaves. Another leaf adaptation is curling or rolling of the leaf. This means that the stomata is protected from the sun, and it also means when it folds in on itself, it creates a bit of humidity, a bit of air moisture, so that heat isn't lost quite as easily. So why is it that despite periods of very long drought in Australia, that there are plants that are decimated yet continue to survive years down the track? Well, the reason for that is because a lot of plants in Australia are something called ephemeral, meaning lasting only a really, really short time. And that means that they complete their entire life cycle, that is germination to propagation to death, in only a few weeks' time. Look at this video here. This is an example of ephemeral plants blooming. This is only a few short weeks. So beforehand, the ground was really, really dry. And then after a quick rain, the seeds which were drought resistant, which were water soluble, were exposed to water and then germinated and grew within just days and weeks. Eventually they do die, but not before they also leave some of their seeds behind for this exact process to happen once more. Okay, so the final sort of part of the plant that has a structural adaptation are the seeds. So a lot of the time in particularly Australian outback, we have plants that produce drought-resistant seeds. The main feature of this is that they have a hard kernel around the outside. So a kernel, just like your popcorn kernels, like the shell, that then breaks apart and germinates under the right conditions. For popcorn, it's the heat that will make the shell burst open. For many Australian plants, it is exposure to water that will make that kernel burst open, allowing the seed to germinate. So this here it's a stylization, but you can imagine these white things here being the water-soluble kernel. So these kernels would have a water-soluble molecule in them, which means that only when exposed to water are they able to then germinate. So they can only germinate and grow in conditions where water is available. Okay, so this is an example of an acacia tree. It has a wide range of structural adaptations. What do we have here? So we have that root tapping system that goes far into the ground, and these roots only really start to grow and extend outwards when they reach water. Phyllodes are like leaves that are shrunken and shriveled, so they're not like big broad leaves, they're more like thick cylindrical fat leaves. Look at the orientation of the leaves, they're vertical, so they're minimizing exposure to sunlight. So we've talked a lot about the plants in arid, hot environments, but what about plants in cold environments? So unlike Arctic dwelling creatures like certain fish, plants don't have antifreeze. So how do they deal with freezing conditions when we know that they are made up mostly of water? There's a couple of things that the plant does. So if we look at these 4 cells packed together, water from the cells can escape through the plasmodesmata into the extracellular space. During conditions of cold and freezing weathers, this water then will freeze rather than the water inside the cells, meaning that the cell, first of all, it won't expand too much because water expands as it gets cold, and secondly, it won't halt any cellular functions within the cell, because as we know, all living creatures need to maintain a constant internal environment for cellular function and metabolism to occur. Why does this water outside the cell, this extracellular fluid, freeze when the inside does not? The reason why is because the cytosol of the cell, so the cytosol within the cell, the watery fluid that makes up the internal environment of the cell, has more dissolved ions than the outside. And this means its freezing point is reduced. So not as high. It doesn't freeze as quickly as the water outside the cell. That's pretty much it for plant adaptations. Just make sure that you are up to date with this here. So this is on Canvas. By the time we have our first class next week, you should have completed all of this. Email me if you have any questions at all, and I will see you for a Zoom meeting tomorrow morning. Bye.